Hello.
Good morning.
Hello, everybody. So today we're going to talk a bit about the Web IDE. I think we can already start because it's already 1 minute past. So let me quickly share my screen and you'll all see the presentation. You can also use Mural directly. I posted the link in the agenda, but I hope you can all see my screen right now. Perfect. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the Web IDE, and especially more into the direction of strategy and vision. There's been a lot going on with the Web IDE, and there's not going to be really many designs today. It's more about like high-level strategy, but let's get right in. So when I started working in the editor group, the Web IDE was in a state where, due to the infrastructure, any new planned features couldn't actually be implemented. The infrastructure was in a state where the setup we chose a couple of months ago didn't make sense anymore for any of the new features that were being planned. This came up in a couple of different cases. And so the team decided to check out a couple of different options. And most of them were actually third-party tools, and see whether we might switch over the entire Web IDE architecture to one of the open source alternatives. And the one option that stood out in the end was Theia. It's a third-party tool, and it was chosen to do a back-end proof of concept around it and see whether implementing this would make more sense than continuing to build our own solution, and see whether we can actually build all the stuff that we already planned to implement in the Web IDE in Theia with less effort and still maintain the same kind of closeness and it being implemented and integrated into the GitLab UI. This was done about 8 months ago. There was not much UX involvement in the beginning. So this entire backend POC happened entirely only due to the infrastructure problems. So when we joined, and we is the PM, Kai, and me, we also had a look at the persona and the stage direction, because the Web IDE already evolved over the time. The initial idea of the Web IDE, as you can see here, it was built by Jacob Schatz as the first proof of concept and was really focused on non-technical users. It was really focused on making small, simple changes. And we already went way further than that. The current strategy is already way more focused on anybody who works in source-controlled projects. And most often, that's also engineers. And due to GitLab having way more engineers who also have great ideas what you can build into a Web IDE and to make or put a lot of effort into coming up with new ideas how this can work in even more great ways. We already built a lot of engineer-focused features into the Web IDE, even though in the beginning it was focused on non-engineers. And this becomes especially clear if you look at the complete maturity chart. When you look at the kind of features that we wanted to build in to get it from viable to complete, you'll see all of this is way more engineer and developer focused than anything else. Luckily, there was already a UX research session coming up that we had planned, and we used this as some kind of a benchmark. We wanted to get users through the complete flow of forking, making changes, adding a file, committing, creating a merge request. We wanted to see how tough is that. And the results were quite troublesome because from the 5 users we had, all of them were technical people. Only 3 of them were able to complete the entire flow successfully. So this already was a problem. But we still went ahead and looked at, if we implement Theia, how much can we actually customize? How much can we actually put it into the GitLab UI? How much can it actually be part of GitLab instead of something that like lives away from it? And together with Paul, I looked at a couple of different things that maybe would have made sense. It was not anything where we already knew this is exactly what we want to build. We just wanted to see what can we actually build with this. Because with third-party tools, there are oftentimes very certain tasks that you might be able to do very easily, but that other tasks that you will not be able to do at all. So we looked at, for example, will it be possible to integrate our navbar at all in this frame? And if so, what are the ways to do this and what implications will this have for the UX? Like, as you can see here, there's already a toolbar that Theia has. How will this live with the GitLab navbar, and what can we do to like make this a good experience? We also looked at how much can we implement GitLab UI components into Theia to make sure that not only are we still implementing pajamas components, but also how, like, what kind of implications would that have for Theia actually, and for the use case that it has. And after we took all these information from the research, from the backend POC, from the front-end POC, we took a step back and looked at what design problem are we actually solving. And the big one that came up was really, we have 2 entirely different user groups with 2 entirely different kinds of use cases. We have the simple, easy to use tool for non-engineers that the Web IDE was in the beginning, while everything that Theia stands for, everything that our complete maturity chart stands for, is allowing developers to switch from local IDEs like VS Code to the Web IDE. And together with that, there were some challenges, as you saw, with using Theia as Web IDE, because there was no way, due to the UI that it uses, due to the kind of complexity that it has, and also due to security and certain architecture decisions, that we can actually integrate it just as the Web IDE into the GitLab framework. It also has a way longer startup time. And that all means that the workflow also has to change completely for how we want to involve the Web IDE into the workflow if we go with Theia. So all of this means we would have a fundamental shift in vision and target group for the entire Web IDE category. And we solved this, and at least this is now our idea, by splitting it into 2 different experiences. We are going to use the old Web IDE, as we call it. We're going to continue to use it, but as a multi-file editor. We are going to make it even easier to use. We are going to pull out features that have already been implemented and that are confusing to users, and really hyper-focus it on small, quick changes that are supposed to be done by anybody. Whereas Theia, as a new Web IDE, is supposed to be for developers. It's supposed to compete with the desktop IDE. It actually should do so. And it's not integrated as much into the workflow. It's more like you have a separate tab open and you continue to use it as your daily use, as your daily IDE tool. Our main idea is to make it a standalone app that's still integrated into the workflow, but it lives in its own tab. You can, for example, reach it via ide.gitlab.com. It still follows the pajamas principles, but it uses other UI components. Because as you saw, an IDE has a very different kind of use than, for example, a web app, as GitLab is. And so to take this into account, we saw in the front-end POC, it just didn't make sense to take over all the exact same kind of components, behaviors, patterns. We would have to be focusing a bit more on what does an IDE actually need. And you can see the difference between the old Web IDE and the new Web IDE very well when you look at the goal. Our goal for the old Web IDE is to open it quite often. We want users to go in, make a change, close it again. That's perfect. If we can get users to continuously make small changes in the Web IDE, this is exactly what we want. We want many different sessions, but each with a short session time. Whereas the Theia new Web IDE is supposed to stay open in a separate tab. It's supposed to be the IDE that the developer works in doing a lot of different reviews, doing a lot of different merge requests. We want the KPI to be long session times. I can also already give you a couple of small details around this multi-file editor vision that we have, but because I've already spoken for way too long, any questions around this? Anything that you want to hear more about? Anything that I should make a bit more clear?
Just to clarify again, what sort of feedback are you interested in getting from us?
So the Web IDE is something that touches a lot of other stages. We've already had contact with, for example, Dimitri around Verify. So one feedback I would love to hear is, how would this really affect the experience in another stage group? Would it affect that at all? And also more around strategy and the vision of it. Not so much about designs, because the designs I'm going to show are completely in a very early state, and I'm not even going to be like, I even have started working on them really. It's just something to make sure that I can communicate what the vision is. Does make that clear? Very clear.
So my first piece of feedback is I love the story that you tell, and very clear, very rational way of talking about the problem, and then finding what potential solutions and options are out there. I think with regards to the new vision, something that is an interesting area to explore is around how you position these two separate value propositions within the context of the broader product. And I think that's a potential research stream that you may want to investigate. So yeah, thinking about it from the value proposition level, and talking about how you position with it and how you can specifically differentiate them as well, and understand what's the right way to effectively work with users' mental models around those two separate value propositions. I just said a bunch of words, but did that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm actually going a bit more into especially the business and use cases for the new Web IDE at the end of this. But you bring up a great point, and we are still in the phase where this is not completely fixed, where this is all under discussion. And so this is a great point to bring up. Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
Hey, Marcel, one thought that comes to mind to me is for secure and defend, there might be opportunities where we're going to start kind of weaving features throughout the entire application. And one of those areas may be the Web IDE. How do we plan to manage, or what are your thoughts around managing which IDE do things go into, and will we run into situations where we need to build it in two places?
No, I don't hope so. I also have something coming up here, and maybe I should actually finish the entire session from the presentation first, so that I can go into all of this. But our hope is also that we can deprecate the single file editor soon. This is something that was planned before already. And actually moving the multi-file editor, the old Web IDE, back from a feature level and making it simpler, easy to use, would actually help us with replacing the single file editor. So our hope is to make the multi-file editor, the old Web IDE, the only real editor that's available in the GitLab UI, whereas the Theia Web IDE is really something that's kind of a related product, but it lives outside of the GitLab UI. And I can show actually a short demo how something similar could look like later. I'm quickly going to finish the presentation because I already see a couple of questions could be answered by some of these aspects that are coming up. So some of the features that we are considering removing from the Web IDE are, for example, the staging. This is something that brought up a lot of problems in the entire workflow of the Web IDE, even for experienced developers. We're going to check whether we want to remove the pipeline view, the review tab, and this is something where I'm not quite sure of, but we are also considering removing the terminal again. What we instead want to add is a merge request flow inside the Web IDE. We don't want, as we already have it right now, a separation where you work in the Web IDE, you create a merge request, you get kicked out of the Web IDE, you have to come back in. It's a weird workflow, and we want to enable this inside the Web IDE. A separate question that came to my mind a couple of times during working on this was how we're going to avoid drifting away from our vision again. Because we already saw that when we implemented the Web IDE the first time, it was really supposed to be for simple use cases, non-technical users, and we arrived at a way more complex feature. So we are going to have regular user research sessions with target users. We're going to try whether we can use is maybe a tough word, but let the new hires help us to see what the experience is for someone who has never worked in the Web IDE when they join and when they have to do some kind of handbook task or when they have to add themselves to the team page. This is something where we want to continuously have a benchmark for ourselves. Are we still solving for these kinds of target users, or are we already going again into more of a developer experience? Two problems that we are still figuring out right now is mobile support. The Web IDE currently is not great for mobile. It kind of works, but it also doesn't. So we have to look into how we can solve that. And the second part is what I mentioned, replacing the single file editor. If I can quickly show what the current version of the Web IDE looks like. I hope you can all see it on your screens. Maybe I can zoom in a bit. Let me quickly see whether I can go out here. So one part that I really want to get rid of is this staged changes area. Unstaged changes, staged changes. The users just didn't see it, didn't understand it. We can make this way clearer if we just from the beginning on get rid of staging at all and move to just changes. This is one example of what I would really like to simplify in the Web IDE. If we look at the new Web IDE, the main advantages and use cases, and this is speaking to what Nick mentioned earlier. What is the new Web IDE actually supposed to do? We want to have an IDE that can compete with the local IDEs and have the big advantage of not having to install all your dependencies, not have to depend on a certain kind of operating system. It's just starting up the browser, working in it, and it directly works. You can see your changes, and I can show a quick demo of how this actually works with Theia itself and a product that they built themselves, which is called Gitpod. So you have this project here. This is something that could be hosted on GitLab. You start it, and you see this is its own UI. It's looking very similar to VS Code. That's because it's built on the same kind of platform. And you can change the code, and you directly have live preview. You can even open a separate tab and see it in here. So every time you make changes, it directly works. You can directly see the changes. This is the kind of experience we want to enable. And all of this has the big advantage of not having to deal with all the dependencies that can really take a lot of time, a lot of complexity. All of this also enables us to push more code into the cloud. We can have more dependency on remote code, so that when you're setting up a new machine, you don't have to care so much about, oh, I have to download all of this again. And especially in the context of new immigration rules, where immigration agents also look at your machine and investigate what you have in there. There's a lot of cases where it's maybe more ideal to have your code somewhere in the cloud instead of having it all on your machine. Additionally, it's built on VS Code platform. So that means we have access to, for example, all the plugins, themes, so that we can use this to enable new features rather quickly. One thing that we already looked into, for example, was live collaboration. There already is a way in Thayer to work on code like in Google Docs. We haven't completely tried out whether it's possible if we also implement this, but it should be. So getting these kinds of features into our actual Web IDE would be way quicker, would take less effort and would be based on open source, so that we can also allow others to contribute easier. So that's the complete presentation. I hope also the value proposition part made more sense to you, Nick.
Yeah, definitely cleared things up. And I think basically positioning these two things that you've just presented to users in a slightly more presentable way, but would get you some good insight. I'm not. that wasn't making fun of your presentation, but thinking about the best way to present these value propositions to users and getting feedback from that perspective, maybe it may be quite interesting. But
Awesome.
yeah, love it. And I especially love the strategy around new joiners getting feedback, like a consistent flow of feedback.
Yeah, and I can also say, if I go back to the UX research, one aspect that helped tremendously doing all of this was that both Kai and me were in the actual UX research sessions. Catherine was incredibly helpful in setting all of the sessions up, but it was so tremendously helpful to have Kai in there as a PM to see what the actual experience is, to see what users are struggling with. We came back all the time talking about like what this user did, what the other user did, what kind of struggle they had. And this really helped us to come to a vision together as a team and not only driven by one department.
Sorry to interrupt. While you're talking on that, because you're talking exactly on the point that I had a little bit of questions. First of all, I think great demo, thanks a lot. And my question was, you mentioned that you tested, you did the research with 5 participants, and you said that only 3 succeeded to complete the tasks. And I'm curious, did you see an overlap with the problems that users faced, and that was the reason why they didn't complete the tasks, and what are the problems being there, and does it actually resolving into the solution to remove the features as you're suggesting?
Yes, definitely. The main problem was the staging. If you look at our Web IDE right now, the way you stage changes is first, everything is unstaged. So you have to actively stage something. But if you go into the flow, there's a couple of different ways you stage it. Either you can stage all changes, or if you leave everything unstaged, you can click the stage and commit button, which stages also everything. But there's also individual stage buttons for each file. The 2 users clicked on the individual stage button and expected everything to get staged, but it was only the one file. So they only committed the one file, created the merge request, got out of the Web IDE, didn't notice the other change got lost because they didn't commit the file. and now had a situation where they actually didn't even see that they didn't complete the task. They thought they had committed both files. They had not.
Clear. Thanks. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions?
Fascinating. I'm so glad that I was able to come. I learned a huge amount from this, Marcel. Thank you. It's beautifully presented.
That's great. I also saw there were 2 comments in the chat. I don't know whether there were any questions in there or whether it was just comments. I can't even see them right now. So if there are questions, feel free to ask them now. Okay, apparently not. Sorry, I interrupted you a bit. Anything else you would like to ask? Anything else where you could see that this might have some influence on the stage that any of you designers are working in? Anything that you could see where this might pose a problem even? Great. Then if anybody has some questions afterwards, feel free to come to me. I'm more than happy to explain all of this. This mule is also equipped with a lot of links. Like, for example, here, I added the link to the actual UX research issue. You can play around with Theia and Gitpod, which is an amazing product. It's really fun to play around with it. You can also look at the actual vision issue where we are talking about how we want to implement this. So if any of you wants to learn more about this, feel free to go in there, comment, or just contact me directly.
So I have 2 requests for you, Marcel. I think it would be useful for everybody in the UX department to watch this, because to the point you are kind of obliquely making, this touches so much. So we want to make sure that everyone is deeply aware. So if you could post this in the UX Weekly call and speak to it briefly, because you got pretty good participation here. We got 18 folks, but we got 40 plus folks in the department. So just, you know, make everybody aware. And then my other request is to post this, if you're comfortable with it, in the Engineering Week in Review doc. Again, I think the more broad awareness we have of this, the better. I also think it's a really good way of showing UX process and what it really includes, and a really good example that UX is not UI polish. It is strategic, systematic thinking about what we're doing. And I know that's a message that we really want to help everybody understand. So if you are comfortable doing those things, I'd really appreciate it.
Definitely.
Cool.
Awesome. So thanks all of you. And I think this concludes the session.